As the war completes 2 years, Russia has gained full control of the long-time Ukrainian stronghold of Avdiivka, which is just a few miles from Donetsk, which it has already occupied. Now, this is Russia's biggest gain since capturing the city of Bakhmut in May 2023. Russia is continuing with its gains in the region, while the West is grappling over continuing its aid to Ukraine. As the war will soon enter its third year, a lot of light has been shed on Russia and the West and their strategies moving forward. Now, we are being joined by Mr. Ben Aris. He has been covering Russia since a lot of years, with stints in Baltics and Central Asia as well. He co-founded BNE and is the former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph. Well, welcome on board, sir. I wanted to get your opinion on this. Now, did the NATO bloc underestimate Russia's war stamina and resolve to fight?
I think they did. We had years under Putin, 2 decades, where they were rubbishing Russia, running it down, telling, this famous quote, but Russia is nothing but a petrol station masquerading as a country. And it was very, en vogue to belittle Russia. And actually, they underestimated particularly its productive power. And that's a key thing, because Russia has this, as a Soviet legacy, this huge manufacturing sector, lots of factories that make things. And they've all been turned to the production of weapons. Very rapidly. And that was another factor, was that Russia and Putin put Russia's economy on a war footing very quickly. They've taken civilian production for washing machines and turned them into shell factories. And the West hasn't done that. The West has not invested in expanding its production, particularly of shells. And so while Russia's producing 2 million shells a year, the West is still under capacity. Borrell at the EU promised Ukraine 1 million shells by March. They've in at well under half that mark. And that's left a big difference on the battlefield, where the Russians are firing 5 to 10 times as many shells as the Ukrainians can. And because of the lack of air cover, this war has sort of descended into a war of attrition and artillery duel that's left Russia massively outgunning Ukraine.
Mr. Aris, it was never a secret, and everyone understood that without Western backing, Ukraine won't last a week. Now, I just wanted to understand from you, how does the West plan to continue funding Ukraine? Because the US foreign aid is still in limbo, that those $60 billion are not reaching Ukraine anytime soon. At least they're not getting past the House of Representatives in Congress, whereas there is a divide in the EU over the funding as well. So how does the West, because European nations would be feeling the fresh pressure of aiding Ukraine in the absence of US funds, how do they plan to continue?
We're going to muddle through. Certainly in the US, the funding, a $60 billion package is on the table, has got caught up in domestic politics ahead of the elections in November. It'll probably resolve in some way. The EU is a lot more committed, although, as you point out, there's lots of fractions within the EU, but then that's the nature of the EU. It's never been unified, and it doesn't have clear leadership. The executive in Brussels does not have control over the member states in the same way that the states is a federation of states. The EU is not. Nevertheless, the EU is stepping up to the mark. It's very committed, and money is being made available. A $50 billion package, a €50 billion package has just been passed, which is to provide the government with money. There's also a thing called the European Peace Funds, which is specifically for military purposes. That's got some money in it. And what I think will happen is we'll see the EU muddling through, and they'll be putting more money into the Peace Fund in order to continue to supply Ukraine with weapons. However, without the US help, then Ukraine is already very undersupplied. And that's already being seen on the battlefield. Last week, Avdiivka, this key city in Donbass, fell to the Russians simply because the Ukrainians were running out of ammunition and they weren't able to hold off the attack. So while Ukraine will muddle through this year, I think it'll keep itself in the game. It's probably going to see some territorial losses, and it's under severe pressure. And the long story is that the Europeans in particular have started to invest into expanding manufacturing, and the talk is that in 2025 all of those facilities will come online and Ukraine will be much better armed than it is now. However, I think bottom line, we have to say that the strategy has never been to allow Ukraine to win. The strategy of the West has simply been to prevent Ukraine from losing. And that will continue even with the lower level funding that we're getting from the EU. It'll still give Ukraine enough supplies in order that they won't lose this war.
Now, the funding from EU that you just mentioned, I just want to now extend it from there. So Hungary has been very vocal about its inhibitions to continue funding Ukraine's resistance. Other EU members are also not committing fully. Now, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said it in as many words that the planned weapons deliveries to Ukraine of most EU member states are not enough, quote unquote. Do you feel the financial pressure of providing military and other aid to Ukraine is drawing a wedge between Western nations?
Yeah, it's under pressure, isn't it? I mean, Germany in particular has been particularly committed to this. The Ukrainians just signed a security pact with Germany and France. And in that pact, Germany has come up with 7 billion euros, which I think is going to go for arms. And that's a significant amount of money. At the same time, the French also committed, in their case, 3 billion. And other money is going from other member states into the Ukrainian Peace Fund. On top of that, NATO, the member states of NATO are supposed to commit some 2% of GDP to military spending. And virtually nobody has done that. I think the UK is one of the few exceptions which is spending that much. But under the expanded defense budgets coming up for this year, many more of the European countries in the NATO alliance have increased significantly their spending up to 2%. And that's money that's going into investment in their own arms. But the Danish, for example, just said we're going to take our entire stock of military shells, which they should hold in reserve for their own defense, and give it to Ukraine. And so again, this is sort of muddling through. People are finding short-term solutions in the anticipation that they're doing more spending, they've invested more, and that by the end of this year, that their production will be allowing them to resupply. And at the moment, it's just sort of an emergency situation, trying to keep enough arms going into Ukraine so that they can at least hold the Russians at bay on the battlefield.
Mr. Aris, I also wanted to come to another aspect which has been raised. It's a question in a lot of people's minds as well, and there have been reports with this. I'll quote one of them as well. EU has issued another round of sanctions on Russia recently, but there have been reports and studies that suggest that several Western nations, Germany, France, Lithuania, the ones which I found mentioned in this report, they have been circumventing these sanctions themselves ever since the first year of the war. Is it clear that European nations cannot do without Russia because they are issuing sanctions on Russia, but they continue dealing with Russia nevertheless? This is a report by and it does mention that indirect export to Russia was most prominent from Germany and Lithuania. And ironically, Germany also happens to be the biggest supporter of Ukraine after the US. So how do you see these two aspects coming together?
Well, there's a fundamental conflict here. I mean, the West assumed that its market is so large and so rich that the sanctions would cripple the Kremlin in terms of cutting it off from its money. But where the underestimation was just how dependent Europe in particular was on Russian imports. And Europe is resource poor. It doesn't have energy enough of its own to run its own economies. It doesn't have metals, minerals, fertilizers of its own enough to run its economy, and those fertilizers, for example, that it was producing are all based on Russian gas. And that gas, when you cut it off, meant that Germany is deindustrializing. 10% of its heavy industry is closed down and can't restart. And those were things like fertilizers. And of course, the EU agricultural sector is entirely dependent. And so where the EU in particular miscalculated was just how dependent they were on Russian imports and how difficult and, more importantly, how expensive it is to replace them. I mean, EU used to be a significant importer of Russian coal, and that's been cut off. But now the coal has to be shipped from Australia, which makes it enormously expensive. And what's happening, we're seeing, is while the Russian economy is booming thanks to this military Keynesian effect of turning all the factories over to produce arms and working 24/7, in the EU, it's slipping into recession. Here in Germany, they just announced we're officially going into recession, and that's hurting everybody. And so you have this fundamental conflict between the political military goals of the executive in Brussels, which is to support Ukraine as long as it takes, and then you have the economic aspects, whereby the economies are slowing and the costs are going up. Germany is now uncompetitive, which is a huge change. And so the industrial lobby and those who are interested in business are pushing very hard to bring this war to an end, to restart the gas, to restart the imports, because that's necessary, because Europe is so resource deficient. Having said all of that, the UK, the US is largely autonomous. I mean, it's not having any of these problems because it produces most of what it needs all by itself.
Well, some very valid points made by you, sir. That was Mr. Ben Aris joining us right here, sharing all his insights. And of course, we do see a lot of underestimation which was on the part of the Western nations regarding Russia. But all of that is now coming to light as we're nearing completing 2 years and entering the third year of the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia doesn't seem to be ready to back off. And of course, Ukraine is trying its best to find resources to continue with the resistance. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Aris.
My pleasure.